All right, welcome back, Anth 220. This is going to be a combined lecture. So finally, I'm not going to upload two different lectures. I'm just going to combine the two topics in one PowerPoint. Now, don't worry about that. I'm not going to talk a lot about either of these two topics. You get to read a number of chapters about food as medicine. So I'm not going to review those. And you get to read a couple chapters that relate to undernutrition. And I'm just going to add on to those chapters. So the food as medicine part of this lecture only consists of this one slide. And I just want to talk about this in broad strokes and then challenge you to read and extrapolate the information from those chapters. So food as medicine. You might not immediately think of food as medicine. I mean, you hopefully have read the chapters and you realize that our lives are full of these perceptions. And the line between what is food and what is medicine, it's not that easy to distinguish, and it's certainly culturally determined in many ways. I mean, it may seem easy to distinguish and universal. I mean, after all, right? You probably have a medicine cabinet, and that might be in your bathroom behind the mirror. You don't go to the medicine cabinet and open that up and find food. You find medicine, in there. And you don't go to the refrigerator and open that up and look for medicine. You go there and open that up to look for food, right? Now, we can define medicine and food from a very basic perspective. We know that these two things are more complex than the definitions I have here, but medicines are basically substances that you take to treat or prevent an illness or disease or symptoms. And food are substances, but one that you eat for growth and development and to maintain life. Now, if you're talking about substances, then both of these things can have nutrients, and both of these things can be about maintaining life. So how do you really draw the line between these two, especially when a medicine in one culture can be considered a food in another culture, and vice versa. And foods and medicines can be the same thing in the same culture. Think about that. I don't just mean like having a cold and you eat certain foods. Maybe it's like chicken noodle soup and drinking Sprite, although that does fall into this category. But if you have high blood cholesterol level, you can treat that. That's medicine. You can treat that, but you can treat it with food. You reduce certain foods, like animal foods, and therefore you reduce some forms of cholesterol in your diet. And you can increase other foods, like fibrous foods, which reduces the amount of cholesterol that is absorbed in your digestive tract. So food is medicine under one context, but it's still food in the same cultural context. Or take the 18th and 19th centuries, the sailing ships from Europe, and scurvy, which you've probably heard of, the disease that led to hundreds of thousands of people dying in the 18th and 19th century, leads to death. And it's the result of a vitamin C deficiency. Your body basically just shuts down without enough vitamin C. And scurvy was devastating crews from Europe that were sailing around the world. Voyages would last months and months before people would reach land where they could then restock. So you need to take food with you, and food that is easy to preserve. I mean, like grains and dried bread and butter and cheese and beer. I mean, those were the staples, not much. And the British discovered that if you also take citrus fruits like lemon on board and the crew eat those fruits occasionally, you can prevent scurvy from happening in the first place. I mean, that's partly the reason why British sailors are called limeys, because they took citrus fruits with them on voyages. But citrus fruits, which are fruits, meaning they are food, and they're eaten as food, but they're also eaten for medicine, preventative medicine, right? So I want to challenge you to read those few articles or book chapters and critically think about food as medicine and relate it to the context of nutritional anthropology. What causes vitamin D deficiency? How does that impact health? How does that relate to food as medicine? How has chocolate served as both a food and a medicine, and how has that changed over time? And how does the health food movement resemble aspects of a religion? And how does that relate to food as medicine? All right, now let's switch gears, and we're going to talk about something that is much less fun to talk about, but incredibly important, present, real, necessary to discuss, and an important part of nutritional anthropology: undernutrition. Now, I've taken those book chapters, and please read those, but I've taken them, and I'll synthesize them with some other material and try to put that into some broader contexts. But first, the definition. What is undernutrition? Undernutrition is basically a form of malnutrition. It refers to malnutrition that comes from not having enough to eat. It is about not getting an adequate amount of nutrients, and especially the essential nutrients that your body needs to simply survive and function normally. And what that means is that we're not just talking about starvation. Now, starvation is certainly an extreme form of undernutrition, but there is a continuum of undernutrition, from starvation to the subtle but measurable inadequate intake of nutrients in an individual's diet or in a population. If we consider the global scale, 1 person in every 8 experiences hunger. And I'm talking about starvation, not appetite and the anticipation of a meal between meals, but the pain caused by lack of food. Hunger is the pain, illnesses, and weaknesses that develop from prolonged, recurrent, and or involuntary lack of food. In this sense, hunger deprives a person of the physical and the mental energy needed to live life. And it can and often does lead to severe malnutrition and death. Millions of people die from hunger every year. And think about that. This is 2017. Millions of people are still dying every year from hunger, and many of these are children, which means, in terms of children, there is about 1 death every 10 seconds. Now, we have a tendency to shut down when it comes to discussing these sorts of topics because, it's hard to think about this, but we need to, and we need to discuss it. And this massive world hunger reality is complicated by pollution and population numbers, which deplete resources. So hunger and poverty and population growth and environmental degradation are all linked together. And when one gets worse, they all get worse. But as we'll briefly look at today, and that we'll certainly get into in the next coming weeks, if the causes and the consequences overlap, so do the solutions. Keep that in mind. There just is not enough time to cover every aspect of undernutrition and hunger, but let's start local and cover some very basic aspects, and then we'll go global and cover also some very basic aspects. So in an ideal world, all people at all times would have access to enough food to support an active and healthy lifestyle. That would be food security. But up on the screen, I've got a definition for food insecurity. That would be limited or uncertain availability of nutritionally or to nutritionally adequate foods. Now, in the U.S. alone, there are 49 million people, and 16 million of them children, that live in poverty and cannot afford to buy enough food to support normal body functioning. Now, I don't know if you know how many people are in the U.S. About 320 million or so. So another way of saying 49 million people live in poverty and face food insecurity is to say that 1 out of every about 6 to 7 families or households in the U.S. experience a type of food insecurity or hunger. 1 out of every 6.5. That is a lot. And that may or may not surprise you. I'm assuming that you have read the chapters, and you know that hunger has many causes. In developed countries like the United States, the primary cause for hunger is food poverty. People are hungry not because there is no food to purchase, but because they lack money to buy food or buy adequate food. The rate and severity of poverty in the U.S. has increased in the last 10, 15, 20 years. And an estimated 15% of people live in poverty, so at or below that poverty income line, which is around $11,000. Now, even people that live above that line don't experience food security. When money is tight, what do we do? And really think about that for a second. I hear people say that I don't have time to go shopping, and that I don't have the money to go shopping, and I don't have money to eat what I really want to eat. People have to choose between food and bills, rent and repairs and medical costs, etc. And things like rent and repairs and medical costs and other bills, those are fixed. And what I mean by that is they are not flexible. You have to pay that at the end of the month or whenever that's due. And it's not variable. The rent this month, say it's $900 or $700, whatever that happens to be, it's the same this month as it was last month, as it will be the next month, right? So you have these non-flexible bills and costs in our life. And what tends to take the hit is food, right? Because food can be variable, and food can be flexible. We can cut back on the amount or change the products that we buy, and that will help cut back on the food bill, which we can't do with other things. Certainly as distressing the issue of hunger is in the United States, and maybe as shocking as it is to some of you, the prevalence is much, much greater, and the consequences are often more severe in larger parts of the world, especially in developing countries, where there is an estimated 827 million people who do not have enough to eat, which again is nearly 1/7 of the world population. And that means about 1 in every 7 households worldwide is starving. Now, the primary cause for hunger worldwide is poverty. And that's probably not a surprise, but the severity of the issue is often difficult to grapple with. Of the world's more than 7 billion people, 25% have no land and no possessions at all whatsoever, except for the very basics like the clothes on your back. Right? People that survive on less, and often significantly less than the equivalent of $1 a day. Not only does poverty cause hunger, but hunger worsens poverty by stripping a person of their good health and taking away their physical and the mental energy that is needed to be an active and productive person. But it's not just poverty. You also have famine, which are food shortages, and when you think of that, you might tend to think of natural causes like drought and flood and pests, which I have here on the screen, right? An image there on the bottom. And that doesn't just happen in developing countries, right? That's happening here as well. You get earthquakes and floods and other natural disasters that lead to food shortages right here in the United States. And natural disasters are still a cause of hunger. But in addition to that, you also get political and economic crises that are created by people. You have political conflicts or political changes. And associated with that, there can be sudden increases in food prices, or a drop in workers' wages, or a change in policy that can leave hundreds, and in some cases, millions of people hungry. And related to politics, we also get armed conflicts. In war, farmers become victims. They become warriors. Their fields become battlegrounds, and those fields, the crops, the food is destroyed. Citizens go hungry, and often famine relief programs are blocked by one or more factions. And another cause is overpopulation. And we tend to overemphasize overpopulation, but the fact of the matter is it's not really just overpopulation that's causing the problem. Here on the bottom of the screen you can see a graphic of the human population growth, and you can see that it is growing massively. There are about 80 million people, new people every year, 152 new people every minute, or the population of California every 6 months. Now, again, it's not actually the number of people, but it's the strain that puts on resources, and particularly fresh water and adequate food. And it's not just the number of people or the growth, but it's the distribution of resources and access to resources. So here is a map on the screen showing you rates of human population growth. And you can see that there are certain parts of the world where population is growing incredibly fast, particularly in parts of Africa, the Near East, some parts of Asia. But when you look at the United States, parts of Europe, for example, there is much less growth. Now here is another map showing something completely different. This is showing the percentage of food consumption per person per country. And you can see that some parts of the world are literally starving, and other parts are literally overfed. And they've done this by manipulating the shape of the country. Starving countries being emaciated, countries that are overfed being expanded. And last, here are the two maps next to each other, and you can see that there's a pattern, that these two maps are highly congruent. So what we are talking about here is a cycle. Population growth often leads to hunger and poverty, which is easy enough to understand. As populations grow, you need to feed more people. But hunger and poverty also often lead to population growth. Poverty has consequences like inadequate food and shelter, lack of access to reproductive health care, and family planning. And families that depend on children, like for farming or for raising domestic livestock or for moving water or caring for adults, right? For those families, children are an economic asset. Now, poverty claims the lives of many young children due to undernutrition and diseases that undernutrition causes. But when families face continual poverty, many people will tend to have more children, partly to ensure that some children will survive. For all of those benefits, right? People only are willing to have fewer children when they are sure that the children that they do have will survive, and that the family has other economic assets, like land, business, skills, something, right? So how do you stop that cycle? Well, you need to increase access and education. If people have access and better access to health care, to education, to family planning, then, as studies have shown, death rates fall. And as the standard of living improves, birth rates also begin to fall. So improving living standards is absolutely essential, because that helps to stabilize the population and population growth. There is only one more broad topic that I want to touch on in this subject, and that is the effects of undernutrition. Now, this affects adults, but it also starts earlier, typically earlier in childhood. So starting with nutrient deficiencies. A child that suffers from a nutrient deficiency might continue to grow, but without adequate nourishment, the body functions begin to fail, and then symptoms of deficiency become more and more present. And this can include some very nasty things, like birth defects, learning disabilities, mental retardation, impaired immunity, blindness, incapacity to work, and of course death, among many other things, like, for example, you are reading about. Now, I'm not going to go over all the nutrients. I mean, we could do that, but that would be ridiculous. That would take a good couple of hours. The nutrients that are typically deficient are iron, iodine, vitamin A, and zinc, among several others. But the prevalence of these diseases, which are actually deficiencies, right, is mind-blowing, maybe to some of you. More than 25% of the world's population has an iron deficiency. We call that anemia, and that can lead to maternal death, preterm birth, low birth weight, increased infections, even premature death. Iodine deficiency leads to stillbirth, irreversible mental retardation called cretinism, and this affects 1 out of every 7 people. I mean, cretinism is found in about 40 million newborn children every year. More than 100 million children younger than 5 suffer from vitamin A deficiencies, and that can lead to blindness, to growth retardation, poor resistance to infections, including very common infections, and zinc, with 20% of the world's population suffering from zinc deficiency. And that can lead to growth failure and pneumonia and other things. As you know, nutrient deficiencies are one thing, but inadequate food intake also leads to growth failure. Nearly 1 of every 4 children in many countries are severely underweight by the age of 5. Those underweight children are often undernourished, and they have a number of diseases that are associated with undernourishment and poverty. Infectious diseases, dysentery, cholera, respiratory illnesses, pneumonia, measles, malaria, dengue fever, etc., etc. The combination of all of this, in addition to undernutrition, increases the likelihood of death dramatically. The risk of death is 2.5 times greater in children with only mild undernutrition compared to nourished children. And that jumps up to 4.6 times for moderately undernourished nourished children, and a whopping 8.4 times greater in severely undernourished children. Every year, 7.6 million children younger than 5 die as a result of hunger and undernutrition, and the diseases that come with that. That is like 5 children a minute. It's staggering, and many are not dying of starvation directly, but from all of these infections that accompany starvation and hunger, like diarrhea and dehydration. There are 2 basic ways that growth is impaired by undernutrition. First, a child might be suffering from an acute, which is often a recent undernutrition, and that results in a child being underweight for their age. This is called wasting. Second, a child may be suffering from a chronic undernutrition or a long-term undernutrition, and they are often short for their age, which is called stunting. There is an estimated 25% of the children worldwide that are stunted. Acute malnutrition, which affects about 10% of children worldwide, has 2 basic clinical forms that I want you to know about and to be able to talk about or compare and contrast for our quiz this week. There is edema, which is more commonly known as kwashiorkor, and that happens when a child goes from the nutrient-dense or the protein-rich breast milk to the nutrient-poor and protein-deficient diet of a crop or a grain diet. And what happens is the muscle mass starts to be absorbed by the body, and by doing so the fluid balance in the body is shifted because there is a lack of protein to regulate it. and as a result, the body becomes swollen, and often the abdomen becomes swollen, and the face becomes swollen to some degree, and that affects the liver, which then cannot clear the toxins from the body. So those toxins build up, and they cause further inflammation, and that creates even more swelling in the abdomen, for example. And you can have a severe wasting known as marasmus, which is starvation. I mean, not having enough to eat and not having enough to sustain life, much less growth and development that occurs so rapidly in children. So what happens is the skin becomes loose. It hangs from the body because the body is eating itself to stay alive. And you can see bones very easily. The brain, as a child, the brain grows to most of the adult size by 2 years of age. But for children with severe wasting, brain growth and development is severely impaired. And that means learning ability is also impaired. This is what starvation looks like. The body's natural reaction to starvation is to stop as much as is possible, to reduce activity. There is no crying for food or crying because of pain, because that takes energy. Heart, lungs, brain function, those are important, but everything else is on a reduced functioning. Growth stops. So a child at the age of 4 might be the same size as they were at the age of 2. And if that continues, the body will literally just eat itself away, and it deteriorates its own gastrointestinal tract lining. And that means that you can no longer digest or absorb food, right, which is essential. That would obviously lead to death. Now, intervention and hospitalization are necessary to prevent death in both cases. Now, we're going to be looking at aspects of solutions towards the end of the term, but I want you to start thinking about that and thinking about causes as well. The world currently produces enough food to feed all people, but the problem of hunger is a problem of unequal distribution of resources, land to grow crops, income to purchase foods. And we have a tendency to turn to the environment for our answers. Hunger and the environment interact in two major ways. First, food production, needed to feed billions of people around the world. Well, that causes damage to the environment, obviously, where you have to clear the land. And two, a damaged environment cannot support food production to feed billions of people around the world. Right? So this is a nasty cycle. And we're going to be looking at this in the coming few weeks in regards to crops and livestock and fishing and energy overuse and water misuse and biodiversity and food waste. And some of you are even exploring this in your final projects. Whew. Okay, let's end there for this week, and we'll pick up next week looking at the other side of the coin, overnutrition. So again, just a review preview for this week and next week. This week, week number 7, we have the lecture, Food as Medicine and Undernutrition. Both of those in one PowerPoint, finally. A number of readings in our book, a number of chapters, and the current news articles. We have our second progress paper due. Click on the link and you can see what that is, an example of that, and our third quiz. As I mentioned in my video update, we do not have a documentary. I'm scratching that for two reasons. One, I want to give you a chance to discuss the other documentary, which we haven't done yet. And I think that we have quite a lot already with this week. So next week we're going to continue with our book chapters. The lecture is going to focus on globalization and overnutrition. And we have our second discussion. Okay, we'll see you next week.